Tonight, let's take a moment to honor those in government service we've lost this year. Yes, Elon claims he's leaving Doge, or at least he claims he's lessening his time there, and it's totally his choice. He definitely wasn't forced out. Now, Elon came into Doge promising to reduce the federal budget by $2 trillion, but after on his own accounts only cutting a mere $150 billion, and BBC analysis revealed that only $61.5 billion of those claims were itemized, and there's only evidence for $32.5 billion, and other analysis suggests that Doge firings and reduced productivity could lead to a net loss of $135 billion for taxpayers. Elon can now ride off into the sunset with the satisfaction of a job well done. But Musk's departure raises more questions than it answered. Like, for example, who was in charge of Doge and who's in charge now? Now, you might think the answer was Elon Musk based on all the, direct statements of the president to that effect, but the answer is a lot more complicated and a lot dumber. So who really is the administrator of Doge? I asked Anna Bauer to find out, and it nearly drove her insane.
Thanks, Devin. So, who is the administrator of Doge? I've spent months trying to get to the bottom of that question, and honestly, the deeper I went, the more it felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Administrator of Doge-induced madness is real, I know, because I've lived it. Whatever the reason, why does it still matter who the administrator of Doge is now that Musk might be leaving? It matters for two reasons. If his role violated the appointments clause, then the decisions he made or directed while leading Doge may still be set aside unless properly ratified by a constitutionally authorized official. Second, it's not entirely clear whether Musk's departure is real or just cosmetic. But before we get to the who of it all, let's talk about the what. What even is the administrator of Doge? The answer to that question is found in an executive order Trump signed within hours of being sworn in on January 20th. In that order, Trump established Doge by basically slapping a new name on an already existing organization within the executive office of the president. He rebranded the former United States Digital Service into something much more chaotic, the United States Doge Service. And while the former United States Digital Service was originally tasked with improving user experience on government websites, the Doge order sets out a new purpose: to implement the president's Doge agenda by modernizing federal technology and software to maximize government efficiency and productivity. As Liz Dye expertly explained, Trump essentially skin-suited Doge into an existing agency like some kind of alien body snatcher. But Trump's order didn't stop there. It also spawned a new subcomponent within the skin-suited U.S. Doge service called the U.S. Doge Service Temporary Organization. As the name suggests, the temporary organization is temporary. The order provides that it shall be dedicated to advancing the president's 18-month Doge agenda and shall expire on July 4th, 2026. And because why stop at mildly confusing when you can just go full space opera confusing, the order also requires every federal department to establish its own in-house team of Doge Bros, which it says will typically consist of one Doge team lead, one engineer, one human resources specialist, and one attorney. To recap the Doge space opera, the United States Doge Service, that's the mothership, formerly the U.S. Digital Service. The Doge Temporary Organization, that's your elite alien strike team operating from within. And the agency-level Doge teams, those are your undercover operatives dispatched to infiltrate and vaporize government functions at agencies across the galaxy. And seated at the command chair aboard the mothership is a mysterious and seemingly all-powerful figure, the administrator of Doge. According to the executive order, the administrator is broadly responsible for implementing the president's Doge agenda, which, again, is undefined but apparently refers to the whole modernize tech, increase efficiency thing. The order also says the administrator heads both the Doge service and the temporary organization. But the administrator's power over the agency-level Doge teams is a little murkier. In court filings, the government has claimed that those agency Doge teams report only to officials within the agencies they're embedded in. Even so, the order gives the administrator at least some influence. The administrator, for example, consults with agency heads to help select Doge team personnel. The administrator also oversees coordination between agency Doge teams and the mothership. And the administrator coordinates with agency heads to help the Doge Bros gain full access to agencies' unclassified records and IT systems. And later later executive orders require those teams to submit monthly reports to the administrator on contracting and hiring decisions. So while the orders don't grant the administrator direct command over agency Doge teams, they do seem to establish a kind of shadow supervisory role. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. This administrator figure doesn't exactly sound like some kind of all-powerful emperor. And you're right, kind of. Because as set out in the executive orders, the administrator's duties and Doge's mission overall are mostly advisory. In theory, they consult, identify problems, recommend changes. Actual decision-making stays with the agency officials. At least, that's the version of the story that the Trump administration would like the courts to believe. From a legal strategy standpoint, framing Doge as just an advisory body has its advantages. For one thing, the administration has tried to shield Doge from public records laws by arguing that it isn't really an agency, since Doge merely advises and assists the president. But it's also a narrative that comes in handy in litigation alleging that Doge or its agents wield too much power in violation of the Constitution's Appointments Clause. In those cases, the government's defense is based in part on the idea that Doge doesn't have any real decision-making authority. But anyone paying even the slightest bit of attention knows there's a mountain of public evidence contradicting that narrative. Doge isn't some harmless think tank in hoodies and sneakers, and the person at the helm of it all, whoever that is, sure seems like he or she wields a suspicious amount of power. And yes, on paper, the administrator is mostly advisory. But here's the thing about paper. It doesn't tweet. The Doge executive orders don't actually name a designated Doge administrator, but at first glance, it seems pretty obvious who it is. At least that's what I thought, and you probably thought that too. We know this because he posted through it. Here's just a taste of some of Musk's social media hits during the first 4 weeks of Trump's second term. February 2nd, Musk announces the Doge team is rapidly shutting down grant payments to Lutheran Family Services. February 3rd, 2 a.m., just after USAID's website mysteriously vanishes, Musk posts, "We spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper." By morning, the agency had closed its headquarters, and days later, thousands of USAID employees were placed on leave. But it wasn't just the tweets. In early February, top government officials, including Trump, the president, seemed to confirm that Musk was, in fact, the guy in charge. February 7th, Musk appears alongside Trump in the Oval Office, fielding questions about Doge. Trump looks at him and says,
"And also, could you mention some of the things that your team has found?"
February 11th, Doge spokesperson Katie Miller posts on X, quote, "The head of Doge and POTUS in the Oval." It's a picture of Musk and Trump. Open and shut case, right? Not exactly. Because even as senior White House officials were calling Musk the head of Doge in public, the administration's lawyers were telling a very different story in federal court. For weeks, as lawsuits piled up against Musk and Doge, government attorneys told judges they didn't know who, if anyone, held the title of Doge administrator. Reporters couldn't get a straight answer either. After one hearing over Doge's access to the Treasury payment system, I asked a government lawyer outside the courthouse to tell me who the administrator of Doge was. His response? I don't know the answer to that. And that's my Joker origin story. Not really, but that is when my descent into who is the administrator of Doge madness really began. And it only got worse from there. Part of my obsession with all this was just how completely absurd the whole thing was. A pack of 20-something meme lords were gleefully gutting the federal government, guided by nothing but JavaScript and vibes. The world's richest man was live tweeting the destruction, and nobody, not even the lawyers defending it all in court, could say who was actually in charge.
Now, if you got fired by Doge, you'll probably want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've got in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you got a data breach letter saying your information might have been leaked, or dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team.
But the real reason I got hooked had something to do with the Constitution, specifically the Appointments Clause. You probably know that Article 2 of the Constitution vests the power of the executive and the president, but the framers didn't want the president to be as powerful as a king. They fought a whole revolution over that. See, one of the main complaints about King George III in the 18th century was his unchecked power to both create new government offices and fill them with loyalists. He could invent a powerful position out of thin air, hand it off to a crony, and send them off to the colonies to carry out his bidding. Understandably, that didn't go over so well, and the founders were so aggrieved by this abuse of power that they even called it out in the Declaration of Independence, saying, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." Yeah, seems bad. So, when they drafted the Constitution, the Founding Fathers thought it would be a good idea to limit the executive's power over federal offices. That's where the Appointments Clause comes in. The Appointments Clause limits the president's power in two important ways. First, it gives Congress, not the president, the power to create federal offices. Second, it lays out the rules that must be followed to properly fill those positions. Now, the rules set out in the Appointments Clause only apply to officers of the United States, and the Supreme Court has interpreted that term to mean people who wield significant authority as a part of a continuing, meaning permanent, position in the federal government. There are two categories of officers, and the appointment process can vary for each. First, principal officers. That's the big dogs like agency heads. They have to be nominated by the president and confirmed on the advice and consent of the Senate. Second, inferior officers. Still powerful, but not exactly top tier, can be appointed by the president alone, or they can be appointed by courts or department heads if Congress says that's okay. But there's an exception to that rule for inferior officers only. The president, courts, or department heads can appoint them without the advice and consent of the Senate, so long as Congress authorizes it. The Constitution doesn't set any appointment rules for the lowest rung on the ladder, that's federal employees, because they don't wield significant executive authority, so they can just be hired like any old regular employee. But here's the tricky part. It's not always clear whether someone is an inferior or principal officer, so courts look to a few key clues to figure it out. One of the most important clues comes from the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Edmund, in which they stated, quote, "Whether someone is an inferior officer depends on whether he has a superior, specifically a superior who is someone other than the president." In other words, if you answer directly to the president and no one else supervises you, you're likely a principal officer, and your appointment needs Senate confirmation. And look, I know that might sound overly formalist or hierarchical, however you say that word, but that's kind of the point. Senate confirmation helps prevent the president from packing the executive branch with a bunch of cronies and loyalists. That's how it's supposed to work, at least. And the Supreme Court has recognized that the Appointments Clause is a significant structural safeguard that bolsters political accountability by ensuring that there's a clear and effective chain of command within the executive branch. All of which is why it might be a problem if someone, say Elon Musk, is out there directing the firing of agency staff, shutting down programs, canceling government contracts, all without answering to a superior officer other than the president and without ever being confirmed by the Senate. That's not just sketchy, that's unconstitutional. Probably. Maybe. I don't really know because the courts have never really had an Appointments Clause case quite like this one. Most cases have involved questions about whether officials like administrative law judges or special prosecutors exercise too much power in violation of the Appointments Clause. Like, remember when Trump got indicted for allegedly retaining classified documents in his shower after he left the White House? He tried to get that case dismissed by arguing that Jack Smith, the special counsel who led the investigation against him, was not constitutionally appointed. Judge Eileen Cannon dismissed the case, reasoning that no statute authorized Attorney General Merrick Garland to make such an appointment. Trump became president before Cannon's decision could be appealed, but Cannon's reasoning was highly dubious, in part because the Supreme Court had already established in United States v. Nixon that the Attorney General possesses statutory authority to appoint a special counsel. Other Appointments Clause cases have raised questions about whether department officials named to carry out duties in an acting capacity were properly appointed to their roles. Or you might remember what happened during the last Trump administration when multiple federal judges found that acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf and acting Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli were invalidly appointed to their positions. That mattered because the court then voided some really important decisions that they made during their time in office. But here's the key difference between those cases and Doge. The people involved were at least formally occupying the roles that they exercised. Jack Smith never denied that he was the special counsel. Chad Wolf didn't pretend someone else was running DHS. Even though their appointments were challenged, they operated under official titles within established agencies and with traceable lines of authority. Doge is different because we don't know who the administrator of Doge is. Here, we have a high-profile figure, Elon Musk, who publicly denies holding any official position with Doge, even though he appears to wield sweeping authority, issuing directives, shutting down programs, even reshaping foreign aid priorities. And that's why at least 3 different groups of plaintiffs decided to file suit against Musk, alleging that he wields unprecedented, unchecked power over federal agencies in violation of the Appointments Clause. One suit was brought by the state of New Mexico, joined by 13 other states. Another suit was brought by a group of former and current USAID workers, and yet another was filed by a coalition of nonprofits. Each suit alleges that Musk is the de facto, meaning actual, administrator of Doge. And as we've established, yeah, that seems pretty obvious. But what seems obvious to you and me isn't always easy to prove in court, where pesky things like burdens of proof and standards of evidence and the presumption of regularity sometimes can get in the way. And as the plaintiffs scrambled to stop Doge's bureaucratic rampage, filing for emergency restraining orders and preliminary injunctions, there were some gaping holes in the factual record. Of course, that's not unusual in the early stages of litigation, before the parties are allowed to subpoena documents and depose witnesses, but no one knew Musk's official employment status, or, for that matter, anything at all about the organizational structure and command chain at Doge, because the administration seemed bent on keeping it under wraps. And it's not like you could submit a FOIA request to find out, because the administration claims that Musk and Doge aren't subject to FOIA. All of which is why, by mid-February, I found myself on a one-woman mission to answer a few increasingly unhinged, but legally critical questions. Who is the administrator of Doge? Is it Musk? If not, then who? Is there an administrator of Doge? Is the administrator of Doge just the friends we made along the way? Okay, maybe not all of those questions were legally critical, but the central one was: who is actually in charge of Doge? Because whoever it is isn't just whispering in the president's ear and posting memes. They're making decisions that upend lives and reshape how our federal government functions. That's not consulting, that's brute, unchecked power. And yet, somehow, government officials kept shrugging it off in court, under oath, in the press briefing room. Their answer to the most basic question, who's running Doge, was a collective shrug. So I did what any deeply online, sleep-deprived person with a law degree and a grudge against opacity would do. I went looking for the administrator of Doge. On February 17th, I got my first real lead. It came from Judge Tanya Chutkan, the same federal judge who once presided over Trump's criminal case in D.C. and now found herself refereeing State of New Mexico versus Musk, which is a suit brought by a coalition of states alleging that Musk and Doge are operating in violation of the Appointments Clause. On February 17th, Chutkan held a hearing on the state's motion for a temporary restraining order to block Doge from doing things like canceling contracts or accessing sensitive agency databases. Though she later denied the motion on grounds that the state did not carry their burden to show that they will suffer imminent and irreparable harm, Chutkan asked the government that day to provide further information about Doge before she ruled. Enter Joshua Fisher. Fisher is the director of the Office of Administration at the White House. In a sworn declaration, he said something that broke my brain just a little bit. Elon Musk, Fisher swore under penalty of perjury, is not the administrator of Doge. In fact, Musk is not even an employee of Doge, Fisher said. Yes, you heard that right. The man who is universally described as the head of Doge. The guy who refers to himself as Doge personified. The guy who tweets out AI art of himself holding a 69420 Dogefather badge. The guy who has openly admitted to accidentally canceling Ebola prevention efforts. That guy? Not in charge, definitely not even on staff. According to Fisher, Musk is employed at the White House as a senior advisor to the president. Fisher wrote, like other White House advisors, Mr. Musk has no actual or formal authority to make government decisions. He can advise the president. He can communicate the president's directives. But according to Fisher, that's it. Oh, and Fisher also mentioned that Musk is designated as a special government employee. a kind of short-term government gig typically used for consultants and experts. The designation means he's supposed to work no more than 130 days within a year-long period. And while he's still subject to ethics rules, it's in a sometimes less restrictive way. Yes, that's the actual phrasing, and no, I don't really know what that means either, but the good news is Devin has a video about it. This is all very convenient. If Musk isn't in charge, if he's just advising the president, and if Doge itself is just advisory anyway, then the administration can claim there's nothing constitutionally fishy going on. No need for Senate confirmation, no appointments clause problem, nothing to see here. And that is exactly what the government has argued in these appointments clause cases. They say that the plaintiffs conflate influence with real decision-making authority, comparing Musk to powerful presidential advisors in prior administrations, including Hillary Clinton and Karl Rove. Musk can't help it that the executive branch listens to his advice, the argument goes. Sure. He's an effective advisor, but he's still just an advisor, and he's definitely not in charge of Doge. Except, come on. Everything else suggested otherwise, including the President of the United States. Just 2 days after Fisher filed his declaration saying Musk had no formal authority, Trump got up on stage, squinted at the crowd, and said,
Signed an order creating the Department of Government Efficiency and put a man named Elon Musk in charge.
So now we had an on-the-record contradiction. The president saying one thing, the White House saying another, and the court stuck trying to figure it all out. When Judge Chutkan issued her ruling denying the state's motion for a temporary restraining order, she even went so far as to remind counsel for the government of their duty to make truthful representations to the court. Meanwhile, the central mystery remained entirely unresolved. By this point, I was asking the question so often that I gave it an acronym, pronounced WITOD, and yet, no answer. On February 18th, the day after Fisher's declaration, the White House press secretary was asked, point blank, who is the administrator of Doge? She refused to say. Just when it seemed like we might spiral forever into a bureaucratic void of finger-pointing and implausible denials, the White House finally revealed a name. The alleged acting administrator of Doge is the person we all suspected from the very start, the most obvious candidate, the person in charge the whole time, Amy Gleason. As news spread across the country, millions of people blinked and said in unison, who? At least, that was my reaction. So who is Amy Gleason? Gleason is a former emergency room nurse turned healthcare technology consultant who previously served under both President Trump and President Biden at the U.S. Digital Service, which is what Doge used to be called before Trump alien body snatched it and turned it into whatever it is now. According to her LinkedIn, Gleason worked at the U.S. Digital Service from 2018 to 2021. After she left the White House, she reportedly went to work for a healthcare firm founded by Brad Smith, who worked on healthcare issues during the first Trump administration and is currently working as one of Musk's top lieutenants at Doge. According to the New York Times, Smith persuaded Gleason to rejoin the U.S. Digital Service, soon to be Doge, at the end of 2024. And that's kind of all there is to know. So, case closed. Right? Not so fast. As journalists scrambled to find out everything they could about the woman who was allegedly in charge of Doge, things didn't really add up. For one thing, when reporters tried to contact Gleason after she was revealed as the administrator of Doge, she was apparently on vacation in Mexico. And look, everyone deserves vacation, but when you're supposedly leading an organization that's in the middle of taking over agencies and dismantling the federal government, it's a really weird time to go to the beach. Even stranger, some people who worked closely with Doge didn't know that Gleason was even in charge. As one person who worked closely with Doge's leadership in a federal agency told ProPublica, quote, I don't even know who Amy Gleason is. Also, Gleason is apparently based in Nashville, which seems really inconvenient for doing things like meeting agency heads or helping the Doge bros get into government databases. And then came the weasel words. In a recent deposition tied to one of the many lawsuits circling Doge, Musk associate Kendall Lindman referred to Gleason as having, quote, formal authority, a phrase that sounds official until you realize it might just mean that her name's on a PDF somewhere. Lindman also admitted Gleason wasn't even appointed until February 18th. the very moment that this administrator question was turning into a political headache for the administration. Between February 5th and February 18th, no administrator at all. During that gap, this guy, Steve Davis, who is also a close ally of Musk, was running the day-to-day, apparently. So let's tally all this up. The administrator was vacationing in Mexico while her team dismantled the federal government. Her name draws blank stares from people working closely with Doge. She allegedly lives in Nashville, not D.C., and it's unclear if she has any real authority. All the while, the president keeps telling people that Elon Musk is the head of Doge. Here's Trump during his March 6th speech before the joint session of Congress.
Which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight.
At best, Amy Gleason seems less like the administrator and more like a placeholder, a convenient name to reference in court filings while someone else runs Doge behind the scenes. So, no, Amy Gleason doesn't look like the real administrator of Doge. She looks like a decoy. Will the courts fall for it? Because this question, who is the real administrator of Doge, is and will continue to be at the center of every Appointments Clause case challenging the actions of Musk or Doge. More than a legal technicality, it's also a proxy for a broader inquiry. Who is really in charge of Doge? Is Musk truly exercising the kind of authority that it sure seems like he's exercising? What's the chain of command at Doge? What even is Doge? Now, judges have already split on the question of whether Musk is or ever really was the head of Doge. That issue recently came to a head in a case called Doge versus Musk, which was filed by a coalition of USAID employees and contractors after Doge dismantled that agency. The plaintiff said that Doge, under Musk's direction, unilaterally closed USAID's headquarters, took its website offline, fired thousands, canceled contracts, blocked employees from their email accounts, all in violation of the Appointments Clause. So they asked the court for a preliminary injunction to temporarily reverse Doge's actions. In response, the government claimed that Musk is merely a senior advisor. They said, that guy? Definitely not running anything, just a consultant. The plaintiffs, of course, had a different story. They argued that Musk was acting as the de facto administrator of Doge, wielding substantial authority over key government functions. And in March, the presiding judge, Theodore Twang, partially agreed. The judge granted the preliminary injunction in part, finding that Musk and Doge's actions to unilaterally shut down USAID likely violated the United States Constitution. Why? Because under the Appointments Clause, anyone who wields significant authority in a continuous position as an officer of the United States must be confirmed by the Senate. Congress can pass a law allowing some other method of appointment for inferior officers, but it hasn't done that with respect to the position at issue in this case, the administrator of Doge. So if Musk really is the head of Doge, and if he really is acting as an officer of the United States in that role, then the Constitution says that he needs to be confirmed by the Senate, which he wasn't. Got that? Anyway, to decide whether Musk really is in charge, Judge Twang looked at some of the same public statements we looked at earlier in this video, all of which led the judge to conclude, quote, Musk was, at a minimum, likely the official performing the duties and functions of the United States Doge Service Administrator. Even if viewed from the standpoint of the senior advisor position he occupies on paper, the record of his activities to date established that his role has been and will continue to be as the leader of Doge, with the same duties and degree of continuity as if he was formally in that position. Having said all that, Judge Twang then held that Musk is likely acting as an officer of the United States and that the plaintiffs are likely to win their Appointments Clause claim. He didn't give the plaintiffs everything they asked for, and we'll get around to why in a minute. But he did order Doge to restore email access for some USAID staff, prepare to reopen USAID headquarters, and to stop firing any more personnel. The government immediately appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And sure enough, a 3-judge panel put Judge Twang's injunction on hold. 2 judges, both appointed by Republican presidents, said that the evidence showed that Musk, quote, acted as a senior advisor to the president and not as the administrator of Doge. They further reasoned that if he's just advising, there's no need for Senate confirmation. Now, that was a bit unusual because appeals courts usually defer to a trial judge's factual findings, and here the district court found that Musk was effectively acting as Doge's administrator. But the appeals panel saw it differently. Meanwhile, a third judge on the panel, Judge Gregory, sided with Judge Chuang on the who leads Doge question. He said Musk's role as de facto Doge administrator is, quote, robust and ongoing, and likely violates the appointments clause. Still, Judge Gregory had one issue. The plaintiffs named the wrong defendants. They had sued Musk and Doge, but not USAID, the agency that technically has the power to restore email access or reopen the building or reinstate fired workers. So, though Judge Gregory found that Musk really is running Doge in violation of the appointments clause, he saw a procedural snag that would prevent the plaintiffs from getting a remedy at this point in the case. The Fourth Circuit almost certainly won't have the last word. Though the injunction is on hold for now, litigation in the district court is ongoing. There, the plaintiffs recently amended their complaint in response to the concerns identified by Judge Gregory, adding USAID and the State Department as defendants. The government, meanwhile, has filed a motion to dismiss, and we're still waiting on Judge Chuang to rule. Meanwhile, in two other appointments clause lawsuits, the ones that were brought by states and nonprofit groups, those cases have been consolidated, and we're awaiting a ruling from Judge Chutkan in D.C. federal court. After initially denying a temporary restraining order in one of those cases, Judge Chutkan then granted discovery, allowing the plaintiffs to subpoena documents and investigate Doge's chain of command. But then the D.C. Circuit stepped in, halting discovery until Chutkan rules on the government's motion to dismiss. So, just like in the USAID case, we wait. And honestly, yeah, that might seem pretty slow, but it's actually pretty normal. Justice is slow, because after all this, I still can't tell you for sure who the administrator of Doge really is. But I can say this. If it walks like an administrator, if it tweets like an administrator, and if it destroys federal agencies like an administrator, it just might be the administrator of Doge.
Thanks, Anna, and I'm sorry. It was impossible to know the full extent of the private government data that Doge has accessed, and the extent to which that data is secured against hackers, and the extent to which Doge will continue to access that sensitive data now that Elon Musk is departing. But a good start in reclaiming your own online data security is to sign up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Because Incogni removes your personal data from online data brokers by reaching out directly and forcing them to take your personal info down. If these data brokers resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. And Incogni just launched a new feature called Custom Removals for subscribers to their unlimited plan that I think is really cool. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people's search sites. Because these data brokers are the reason why in the US you can search your name and find a bunch of websites that will give anyone your home address, phone number, and extensive history. It's shocking just how easy it is to find all this information. It also might be why you're getting so many spam calls lately, or even how someone might steal your identity. But Incogni is a great way to take back control of your data, increase your online privacy, and cut down on those annoying scam calls and emails that used to flood my voicemail and inbox. Now, I've been using Incogni for years, and in that time you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns for me over the years and is processing dozens of others. If I were to try this myself, it would take weeks. So thank you, Incogni, for saving me hundreds of hours and adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals, because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it again. Incogni makes sure that your personal information stays off the market for good. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you click on the link that's on screen or down below, you can try Incogni risk-free for 30 days and get a full refund if you're not into it. And if you do decide to keep it, you'll still get the exclusive 60% off discount, so long as you use my link or the code LegalEagle, all one word, at checkout. So after you sign up for Incogni, click over here for more LegalEagle, or I'll see you in court.